The stage is set, a generational showdown. The auditorium crackles with an electric tension that seems to bend the very air. Under the merciless glare of studio lights, Karoline Leavitt stands poised at the edge of political theater, her shoulders squared against the weight of expectation. The White House press secretary, a rising star in a firmament typically reserved for those decades her senior, surveys the battlefield before her with the calculated calm of a strategist who has anticipated this confrontation for months. Across the stage, Robert De Niro's presence looms larger than his physical frame should allow. The Hollywood titan, whose face has portrayed gangsters, fathers, and heroes across generations of American cinema, now wears an expression no director ever scripted: raw indignation. His accusation of Leavitt as nothing but Trump's puppet still hangs in the atmosphere, the words suspended like smoke after gunfire. Between them stretches not merely empty floor space, but a vast ideological chasm, a divide between old guard and insurgency, between established cultural authority and emerging political force. The audience, sensing the historical weight of what they're witnessing, leans forward, collectively, their breaths held hostage to what happens next. "This is the confrontation that encapsulates America's political realignment," whispers a senior producer to her colleague backstage. Old power meeting new power on live television. Leavitt's preparation for this moment has been meticulous. For weeks, her team has compiled and analyzed De Niro's past statements, his political allegiances, his contradictions. She has rehearsed not just responses, but counterstrikes, knowing that in this arena, defense alone ensures defeat. Her youth, often weaponized against her by critics, has become her armor. She represents a generation accustomed to having every mistake documented and disseminated globally within seconds. De Niro, meanwhile, carries the confidence of cultural royalty. For decades, his voice has carried weight beyond his scripts. When he speaks on political matters, millions listen not because of policy expertise, but because of the gravitas he's accumulated through decades as America's cinematic conscience. Yet that same confidence has perhaps left him vulnerable. Preparation for celebrities rarely matches the rigorous briefings of political operatives. Social media algorithms are already accelerating, as if sensing the viral potential of what's unfolding. Content moderators at major platforms brace themselves for the tsunami of reaction videos, memes, and hashtag wars that will inevitably follow. In newsrooms across the country, producers are pre-writing chyrons and headlines, hedging bets on whose narrative will prevail. "What we're seeing," notes a political scientist watching from her university office, "is the perfect crystallization of how authority is being renegotiated in American politics." De Niro represents cultural authority derived from artistic achievement and longevity. Leavitt represents institutional authority granted through political appointment, despite her youth. The confrontation transcends the individuals involved. It stands as a proxy battle in America's ongoing cultural civil war, a war fought not with weapons but with words, symbols, and the ability to capture public imagination. Both combatants understand their roles as avatars for larger movements and ideologies. As Leavitt takes her first step forward, time seems to compress. The generational divide between them, nearly half a century, suddenly feels like the most relevant metric in the room. She has prepared for this moment since watching political debates as a child. He has avoided substantive political challenge throughout his storied career, protected by the buffer of celebrity. In the network control room, directors frantically switch between camera angles, trying to capture both faces simultaneously. They know that tomorrow's narrative will be determined not just by what is said, but by whose reaction shot becomes the screenshot shared millions of times across digital platforms. "This is how political reputation is forged in the modern era," murmurs a media analyst to his podcast co-host. "Not through policy papers or voting records, but through moments of confrontation that capture the collective imagination." Leavitt's microphone activates with a subtle click that seems to echo through the hushed auditorium. The audience collectively tenses, sensing that whatever comes next will transcend this room and this moment. The first words she chooses will establish not just her response to De Niro's accusation, but potentially reshape the dynamics of celebrity influence in political discourse. As she draws breath to speak, the invisible architecture of power in the room begins to shift. The nation watches, divided yet united in their anticipation of a confrontation that will be dissected, analyzed, and mythologized long after the broadcast ends. In this suspended moment between accusation and response, American political theater finds its perfect, breathless intermission. The stage is set, the the players are ready. And the next words spoken may well reshape how a generation understands the intersection of politics, celebrity, and authority in a media landscape where viral moments often outlive policy achievements. The actor's fury, De Niro unleashes. De Niro's patience had reached its breaking point. The legendary actor's face contorted with a rage rarely seen outside his most intense film performances as he leaned into the microphone, the full weight of his Hollywood gravitas bearing down on the moment. "Trump is a disaster for this country, a complete and utter catastrophe," De Niro thundered, his voice carrying the signature Tribeca rasp that had commanded respect across 6 decades of American cinema. "And you," he continued, jabbing a finger toward Leavitt, "you're nothing but a trained mouthpiece, parroting whatever nonsense he feeds you." The crowd erupted. De Niro's supporters, predominantly coastal liberals and entertainment industry veterans who'd watched his career evolve from taxi driver to political firebrand, rose to their feet. Their applause cascaded through the auditorium like rolling thunder, validating the actor's raw, emotional display as a moment of authentic truth-telling in an era of calculated political messaging. Leavitt remained motionless, her expression calibrated to project unfazed composure. Behind that carefully constructed facade, however, her team knew she was cataloging every syllable of De Niro's outburst, mentally preparing the counterattack that would follow. What the audience witnessed was more than merely an actor venting political frustrations. It represented the culmination of America's celebrity political complex, a system where cultural icons like De Niro had long enjoyed a privileged position in political discourse, their opinions amplified by decades of public adoration rather than policy expertise. "This is the established order fighting back," whispered a Republican strategist to his colleague in the back row. De Niro embodies the cultural elitism that's losing its monopoly on shaping national conversation. Indeed, the actor's outburst carried the unmistakable undertone of generational entitlement. At 80, De Niro had accumulated the kind of cultural capital that once guaranteed deference, particularly from someone of Leavitt's youth and relative inexperience. His fury seemed partly fueled by the audacity of her challenge to this unspoken hierarchy, a young woman presuming to stand as his equal in a battle of ideas. In network control rooms, producers frantically cut between shots of De Niro's impassioned delivery and Leavitt's calculated stillness. Content creators recognized the unmistakable signature of viral content forming in real time, emotional authenticity from a beloved cultural figure crashing against the disciplined restraint of a professional political operative. "We're witnessing the collision of two Americas," observed a media studies professor watching the broadcast. De Niro represents the cultural authority that once dictated acceptable political discourse. Leavitt embodies the insurgent force that questions why actors should have special standing in these discussions at all. The cheers began to subside, creating that dangerous vacuum in political theater where momentum can shift in an instant. De Niro, perhaps sensing this vulnerability, doubled down. "I've seen enough in my lifetime to recognize a con man and his enablers," he continued, his voice dropping to the menacing register that had chilled audiences in Goodfellas and Cape Fear. "History will remember who stood where during this disgraceful chapter." More applause followed, but something had shifted. The initial emotional wave had crested, leaving the rational aftermath where Leavitt operated most effectively. Media analysts noted a subtle change in the audience's body language, the natural evolution from emotional reaction to intellectual assessment. On social media, the first wave of reaction had already formed along predictable tribal lines. De Niro's supporters proclaimed his authenticity as a refreshing break from political artifice. Trump's base highlighted the actor's outburst as evidence of Hollywood's disconnection from mainstream America. The algorithms accelerated, amplifying the most extreme interpretations while burying nuance beneath engagement metrics. "De Niro just handed her the perfect opportunity," texted a veteran political consultant to a colleague. Emotional outbursts always leave openings for the disciplined opponent. As the applause finally faded, a pregnant silence filled the auditorium. De Niro stood there, emotional momentum spent, suddenly vulnerable in that dangerous territory between passionate delivery and substantive follow-through. The actor who had brilliantly delivered countless scripted lines now faced the improvisational challenge of political debate against an opponent who had been preparing for this exact moment her entire professional life. The spotlight slowly shifted to Leavitt, who hadn't moved a muscle during De Niro's tirade. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as she methodically adjusted her microphone. Unlike the actor's emotional explosion, her response would emerge from calculated strategy rather than spontaneous feeling, the fundamental difference between their approaches to this political theater. What happened next would not merely determine a momentary victor in an isolated debate, but potentially recalibrate the influence celebrity endorsements carry in American political discourse for years to come. The counterattack, Youth Dismantles Legacy, the silence that followed De Niro's emotional barrage, wasn't merely the absence of sound. It was tactical terrain that Karoline Leavitt had mastered through countless White House briefings. As she finally rose from her seat, the room's atmosphere transformed from the passionate chaos of Hollywood dramatics to the surgical precision of political warfare. "With all due respect, Mr. De Niro," Leavitt began, her voice carrying the controlled cadence that had become her trademark, "your assessment demonstrates precisely why Americans have grown weary of celebrity political commentary." She moved with calculated efficiency toward the center of the stage, diminishing the physical space that had protected the actor's cultural authority. What followed wasn't merely a rebuttal, but a carefully orchestrated dismantling of the generational power structure De Niro represented. "While you've been delivering lines written by others in the comfort of film sets," she continued, extracting a folder containing meticulously highlighted documents, "many Americans have been struggling under policies you and your colleagues have championed from behind mansion walls." The strategy was immediately apparent to political observers. Leavitt wasn't attacking De Niro's arguments. She was challenging his very legitimacy in the political arena. By positioning him as fundamentally disconnected from everyday American reality, she transformed his passionate display from righteous indignation into privileged elitism. "Let me share some facts rather than emotional declarations," Leavitt said, her youth suddenly becoming not a liability but a weapon. She methodically presented economic data contradicting De Niro's earlier claims, her delivery stripped of theatrical flourish yet devastating in its precision. On split screens across America, the visual contrast couldn't have been more striking. De Niro's flushed face and disheveled appearance juxtaposed against Leavitt's composed demeanor and organized presentation. The narrative was shifting in real time from seasoned wisdom versus inexperienced youth to emotional overreaction versus factual authority. Mr. De Niro referenced his lifetime of experience, she noted, allowing herself the faintest smile, yet seems unaware that median household income increased substantially during the previous administration, particularly among the working-class Americans he claims to champion. Facing the audience directly, Leavitt then executed the move her team had prepared for months, contextualizing De Niro's comments within his own contradictory statements. "In 2016, you stated that economic inequality was your primary political concern," she said, quoting directly from a Guardian interview. "Yet today, you've dismissed policies that demonstrably reduced that inequality." The audience's reaction revealed the effectiveness of her approach. The cheers and applause that had earlier validated De Niro's emotional authenticity now seemed transformed into something more problematic, the sound of celebrity privilege being reflexively defended despite contradicting evidence. "Perhaps most telling," Leavitt continued, her confidence visibly growing as De Niro shifted uncomfortably in his chair, "is that your critique contains no substantive policy alternatives, only character attacks that mirrored the divisive rhetoric you claim to oppose." Social media metrics confirmed the dramatic shift occurring. While liberal outlets had initially celebrated De Niro's passionate denunciation as a viral moment of resistance, conservative platforms were now amplifying Leavitt's methodical dismantling of his arguments, framing it as youth-led revolution against entrenched cultural gatekeepers. "The American people deserve substance over celebrity," Leavitt concluded, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who had just successfully reframed the entire conversation. "They deserve leaders who understand their daily struggles rather than lecture them from positions of extraordinary privilege." De Niro's expression darkened, the familiar intensity of his most memorable film roles now surfacing not as practiced performance, but genuine frustration. For perhaps the first time in decades, the legendary actor appeared genuinely blindsided, trapped in a political confrontation where his cultural cachet had been neutralized by meticulous preparation. In network newsrooms, the narrative was already being recast. What began as, quote, "celebrated actor confronts Trump spokesperson," was rapidly evolving into "generational showdown reveals changing dynamics of political influence." Conservative commentators gleefully highlighted the moment as evidence of a fundamental shift in cultural authority, where facts deployed by rising political talent could effectively counter the emotional appeals of entertainment industry veterans. As De Niro leaned toward his microphone, visibly struggling to formulate a response that wouldn't appear defensive, the power dynamic had unmistakably shifted. The younger generation, that had once looked to figures like him for cultural and political guidance, was now questioning the foundations of that authority system itself. The confrontation had transcended its immediate participants, becoming instead a potent symbol of America's evolving relationship with celebrity political influence. In living rooms across the country, viewers weren't merely witnessing an isolated debate, but a realignment of whose voices carried weight in national discourse. De Niro's reaction in the moments that followed would determine not just the outcome of this singular confrontation, but potentially foreshadow the changing influence of Hollywood's political activism. In an era where prepared facts increasingly trumped emotional appeals, no matter how authentic or impassioned they might be. The archive ambush, how Leavitt weaponized De Niro's past against him. The debate had reached that precarious moment when experience confronts preparation, when Hollywood gravitas collides with political calculation. De Niro's impassioned defense of progressive values still hung in the air, his celebrity authority seemingly unassailable in the crowded auditorium. But Karoline Leavitt's measured smile revealed what the actor had yet to realize. She had been waiting for precisely this opening. With the practiced timing of someone who had weathered countless White House briefings, Leavitt reached for a tablet positioned strategically at her side. The audience's murmurs subsided as the large screen behind them flickered to life, and there was Robert De Niro himself, 12 years younger, speaking with reverent admiration about President Obama. "Perhaps you'll recognize this passionate endorsement, Mr. De Niro," Leavitt said, her voice carrying a calm that contrasted sharply with the actor's earlier intensity. The footage played with devastating clarity, De Niro lavishing praise on policies and leadership approaches he had just moments ago condemned. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and visible across the auditorium. De Niro's supporters shifted uncomfortably, while Leavitt's contingent leaned forward, sensing blood in the political waters. "That was you in 2012, Leavitt continued, allowing the silence to amplify her words, celebrating the very governance model you've spent the last 30 minutes denouncing. The strategy wasn't merely to highlight inconsistency, it was to systematically dismantle the moral authority that had been the foundation of De Niro's entire argument." By weaponizing his own words, Leavitt transformed De Niro from cultural oracle into something far more damaging in modern politics, a hypocrite whose convictions shifted with partisan winds. "The American people don't need lectures on integrity from those whose principles appear contingent on which party occupies the White House," she said, her youth suddenly an asset rather than a liability. Each word landed with the precision of someone who understood that in the arena of political combat, archived footage was sharper than any emotional appeal. For De Niro, the moment represented a fundamental miscalculation. His decades navigating Hollywood had not prepared him for an opponent who had studied his political history more thoroughly than he had examined hers. His expression darkened, recognizing too late that his passionate authenticity had been outmaneuvered by methodical research. The crowd's response told its own story. What began as scattered applause from Leavitt's supporters swelled into something more substantial, the sound of a narrative shifting, of entertainment industry authority being questioned by younger voices armed with the receipts of inconsistency. "I respect your remarkable career, Mr. De Niro," Leavitt continued, her tone suggesting precisely the opposite. "But the American people deserve consistency from those who claim moral leadership in our national conversation." Across social media platforms, the moment was already fragmenting into competing narratives. Progressive commentators labeled it a cheap political trick, while conservative voices celebrated it as accountability for liberal Hollywood. The generational dimensions magnified the impact. Younger viewers dissected De Niro's discomfort with the same clinical attention once reserved for film analysis, finding in his reaction the telltale signs of institutional authority confronting its own limitations. Media producers in network control rooms made split-second decisions about how to frame the exchange. Should they emphasize De Niro's distinguished career and contextualize the apparent contradiction? Or focus on Leavitt's tactical precision in delivering a politically devastating blow? These editorial choices would shape how millions process the confrontation. "When you praised these identical policies under Democratic leadership," Leavitt pressed, sensing De Niro's vulnerability, "were you mistaken then, or are you mistaken now?" The dichotomy was brutally efficient, forcing De Niro to either admit past error or current inconsistency. It was the kind of false choice familiar to press secretaries who had mastered the art of question deflection, now weaponized against a man unaccustomed to such rhetorical traps. The timing could not have been more symbolic of America's political metamorphosis. A generational transfer of power was playing out, not through policy or electoral politics, but through the mechanisms of public discourse itself. Leavitt wasn't merely challenging De Niro's arguments, she was contesting Hollywood's presumption of moral authority in national debates. As the applause for Leavitt's counterattack reached its crescendo, cameras captured De Niro's fingers tightening around his armrest, a physical manifestation of a man grasping for control in a confrontation that had slipped beyond his considerable talents. His legendary ability to channel controlled rage had served him well through decades of acclaimed performances, but in this moment authentic anger threatened to undermine whatever response he might formulate. The moderator glanced nervously at the clock, aware that what had been scheduled as a balanced discussion about cultural values had transformed into something far more consequential, a moment that would reverberate through cable news cycles and social media feeds for days to come. Whatever De Niro said next would determine whether this exchange would be remembered as a temporary embarrassment or a defining inflection point in the relationship between celebrity advocacy and political accountability. As De Niro leaned toward his microphone, the question hanging over the auditorium wasn't simply what his rebuttal would contain, but whether Hollywood's progressive vanguard had finally met a generational challenger it could not simply dismiss or overwhelm through cultural capital alone. The digital aftershock. Within minutes of De Niro's stunned response, the confrontation metastasized beyond the confines of the auditorium into the vast ecosystem of social media. What had begun as a controlled political discussion transformed into a digital brushfire that algorithmic engines propelled across the national consciousness. Trending hashtags bifurcated along predictable ideological fault lines. Hashtag Leavitt destroys and hashtag De Niro shutdown competed for dominance as content moderators struggled to manage the tsunami of reactions. Each camp furiously edited clips to serve their narrative. Conservative outlets focusing on Leavitt's methodical dismantling of De Niro's inconsistencies, while progressive platforms emphasized what they characterized as the actor's dignified restraint in the face of calculated ambush. What we're witnessing is political theater's adaptation to digital native audiences, explained one media analyst on a cable news panel. Leavitt understood that the victory wouldn't be determined by who won in that room, but by who controlled the narrative that would ricochet across millions of screens in the hours that followed. The generational dimensions of the exchange became impossible to ignore. Viewers under 35 overwhelmingly processed the confrontation through Leavitt's frame, seeing in her tactical precision a necessary challenge to celebrity authority. One viral TikTok with over 2 million views within hours captured a political science student's assessment. De Niro thought his Hollywood gravitas would insulate him from accountability for his political contradictions. Welcome to a world where every statement lives forever in digital amber. Meanwhile, older demographics rallied behind De Niro, arguing that Leavitt's approach represented everything wrong with modern political discourse, a gotcha culture that prioritized moments over substance. She may have won the clip, but he still carries the moral weight of someone who's actually lived through the consequences of these policies, wrote one prominent boomer columnist, whose defense of De Niro was shared over 50,000 times by an audience desperate to contextualize what they'd witnessed. Public figures rapidly staked out territory in the digital battlefield. A congressman from Florida tweeted, "Watching Karoline Leavitt expose Hollywood hypocrisy in real time is exactly why this administration connects with Americans tired of being lectured by coastal elites." Minutes later, an Oscar-winning actress countered, "When we reduce decades of principled advocacy to selective editing and ambush tactics, democracy itself becomes performance art." In newsrooms across the country, editorial decisions shaped how the confrontation would be metabolized by the public. The New York Times opted for a headline emphasizing the substantive policy disagreements, while digital native outlets focused on the emotional dynamics. De Niro visibly shaken after press secretary's calculated takedown goes viral. Political strategists from both parties studied the exchange with professional appreciation. Leavitt converted a defensive position into an offensive masterclass, noted one veteran campaign manager. She understood that in our fragmented digital landscape, the perception of authenticity has replaced factual accuracy as the primary currency. What made the moment particularly significant wasn't simply the clash between Hollywood and politics. Such confrontations had become commonplace in American public life. Rather, it was the clear demonstration of how generational power had shifted in the political arena. Leavitt, barely in her 30s, had weaponized the digital literacy of her generation against a figure whose cultural authority was forged in an analog age. Her strategic deployment of De Niro's archived statements represented the political application of what younger voters did instinctively, excavating digital histories to evaluate consistency. The most revealing aspect wasn't what happened on stage, observed a communication professor whose analysis gained traction across academic Twitter. but how different demographic groups processed it afterward. We're not just divided by politics anymore, we're divided by our relationship to information itself. As evening news programs prepared their coverage, production teams faced an immediate challenge. The confrontation had generated so much online speculation and partisan interpretation that establishing a neutral framing had become nearly impossible. The narrative had already been claimed by competing ideological forces, each constructing their version of reality around the same core footage. Back in their respective headquarters, both camps conducted rapid damage assessment. De Niro's publicist fielded calls from progressive allies offering opportunities to reframe the exchange, while Leavitt's team meticulously tracked engagement metrics showing unprecedented reach for a press secretary, typically overshadowed by more senior administration figures. Behind closed doors, however, more calculated discussions were taking place. As one White House insider would later reveal, Karoline knew exactly what would happen when she pressed that button. The debate wasn't the target, it was merely the venue. The real audience was watching on phones and laptops, where younger voters would recognize and reward the authenticity of holding someone accountable for their contradictions. As night fell on Washington, the trending topics continued their digital warfare. What remained to be seen was whether this viral moment would solidify into something more substantial, a genuine inflection point in the political conversation, or simply another ephemeral controversy destined to be displaced by tomorrow's outrage. For De Niro and Leavitt, however, the consequences were already rippling outward, reshaping their public personas in ways neither could fully control.